Hi there, Eoin O'Brien, Sinn Féin's housing spokesperson here. Last week we organised a really great webinar on the government's controversial shared equity loan scheme. We had Toby Lloyd, a leading housing economist from England and former advisor to the British government, talk about how a similar scheme there pushed up house prices and saddled working people with very, very high levels of debt. We also had well-known Irish economist and commentator David McWilliams describe the dangers of the introduction of such a scheme here, particularly for hard-pressed working people who are struggling to afford to rent or buy. The debate was ably chaired by my party colleague, Sinn Féin spokesperson for public expenditure and reform, Galway TD Mairéad Farrell. So if you're interested in this scheme and if you want to know why it's a bad deal for working people and indeed a bad deal for the taxpayer, then listen on.
An fáilte chur of Toby Lloyd agus David McWilliams tá ag sú go mór leis an gcóra a nacht. I want to welcome, I suppose, Toby and David to this discussion. I think it's going to be a very interesting discussion. I'm looking forward to hearing what both of you have to say. And I suppose as a way of introduction, I might start with you, Toby. Toby is based in Britain and he was the former head of policy for Shelter, and he was also a former special advisor on housing and local government to the British Prime Minister in 10 Downing Street. And he is the author of the book Rethinking Economics of Land and Housing, which he wrote alongside two UCL economists. And I think for an introduction for David McWilliams, I think a lot of you probably know of David and particularly his podcast. Anytime I ask anyone for a podcast recommendation, David's is always first on the list of recommendations. But of course, as many of you will know, David is also the founder of Kilkenomics, which is an economics festival with a bit of a comedic twist. And he is, of course, very much a journalist and a broadcaster. But Toby, I think I might start with you first and invite you to speak first. And I think I'd be very interested in hearing your views on the British scheme, which our scheme will be based on. So if you could give us your viewpoints in relation to that.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I should preface this by saying that housing being an incredibly parochial issue, at least certainly in the UK, generally we know absolutely nothing about what goes on. I mean, even Scotland is a completely different territory with its own system. So UK housing policy is incredibly parochial. I know very little about the situation in Ireland at the moment, beyond what I read in the regular press. So I certainly don't claim to be an expert in your situation. But I do have a lot of experience of the Help to Buy scheme in this country, which I believe is largely the one that is being copied here. So yeah, the short answer to your challenge is it's a really dangerous road to go down, right? And this is, but it's not clear cut and it's not simple. The UK government has extended the scheme in England repeatedly. So from its original start in 2013, and it was originally supposed to be an immediate short-term response to the financial crisis and the slump, and to keep house builders building and to boost home ownership and to get the economy moving and all the rest of it. And a case could be made, I suppose, at least within kind of conventional economic frame that was valid at the time. But here we are, almost 10 years later, and the scheme is continuing and shows no sign of disappearing, right? And every few years it'll come up again. It's like, should it finally be wound down? And every few years there's another reason why, well, actually we probably do need to give it another 10 billion pounds or something. And so it costs an awful lot, and it's proven very, very difficult to get out of once you're in it. So be very careful about going down this road at all, would be my first bit of advice. Specifically, I think there are a set of different concerns about Help to Buy. The first is just on the consumer side, right? It offers the potential for hard-pressed home buyers who are desperately struggling to buy their first home and get on the housing ladder, who are a very kind of sympathetic group, at least within kind of the political discourse in this country. Everyone feels sympathy for them, and it gives them a chance to get that first home and hopefully put down roots and raise their family and all the rest of it. So it's politically very, very attractive. But it's very questionable whether it really works for them as consumers. The first most obvious point is that it's attached purely to new builds, because that's obviously the point, is to stimulate housing supply, which makes perfect sense, except that new build property already attracts a premium. It's quite hard to really say definitively how much that premium is, because you've got to compare it to existing property markets, which are obviously slightly different, blah, blah, blah. But by any estimation, the new build premium has gone up significantly since Help to Buy was introduced. The government's own estimation was that it was at 19% a few years ago. A recent study suggested it was now 33%, i.e. a new build property is now costs 33% more, a third more than an equivalent property in the second-hand market. Now, if the government is giving you, we'll leave aside the fact that you've got to pay it back for now, but they're giving you 25% of that price, you're still paying more to get that property than you would have if the scheme had not existed and you were buying in the existing market. So it's not even clear that it's a good deal for that very, very straightforward case that it's supposed to be providing in the first place, i.e. to give people a foot on the ladder. And of course, that premium disappears as soon as you've moved in. Those, it's like the proverbial car that loses, 20% of its value as soon as you drive it off the forecourt. The same is true for new build property. It doesn't retain that extra value that comes because it's shiny and new. So a lot of that government subsidy that goes into it, that property, vanishes almost immediately. Except, of course, firstly, that the consumer still owes it. Right? The home buyer still owes that back to the government and will be required to pay it back. I think Eoin said that it was after year 6. In this country, it's after year 5 you start having to pay interest. At first, that interest at a very reasonable rate, but it escalates quite rapidly over time. So after 10 years, you will find yourself in a really, pretty tight affordability squeeze as a buyer of one of these properties, and we will see that. And if you just look at the British press, and you'll see lots of headlines now: is Help to Buy the next PPI scandal? Is this the next mis-selling scandal? Are private banks, private house builders going to be on the hook for huge amounts of political and possible legal risk as a result of having sold people this product? And of course, it's not just the private sector, it's the government too. The government is on the hook for this. The government has not only provided the equity loan and given its kind of approval to it, but it will then be enforcing on those contracts. At some point, the government is going to end up repossessing people for non-payment of loans, and that's going to look extremely unpleasant and be politically quite unpalatable for whoever happens to be in power at the time. So for a consumer, I think it is highly questionable, and particularly in places like London, where the loan is actually up to 40%, the risk is really quite high. That you can just about get away with that if house prices rise and rise and rise, and you're able to pay off your debt by remortgaging. Fine. Right now, I wouldn't want to bet that house prices are going to have risen dramatically in 10 years when those loans start being repayable. Okay? So there's the serious risk for the consumer. Secondly, there's serious risk about what we get built as a result. This has essentially been a massive boon for the house building sector, for the private house builders who have really, have really come out to defend it very strongly. And no surprises. I mean, they have essentially received over £16 billion in direct government subsidy under this scheme. It's been an extremely nice little earner for them. So much so their share price has risen dramatically, their cash surpluses have risen dramatically. The chief executive of the largest house builder in the UK pocketed a £75 million bonus the other year, off the back of an over £1 billion of direct government subsidy for his company. So, this gets politically quite sticky for any government and is highly questionable in housing policy terms. But my concern is deeper than that, though. It's that we're actually subsidising a pretty dysfunctional model of house building itself. So by sustaining this particular kind of large speculative house builder model, we're actually building ourselves further into the hole that we found ourselves in 10 years ago. In other words, we're more and more dependent on the same large speculative companies for our housing supply. And, while I don't want to tar them all with exactly the same brush, but fundamentally that model is broken. It does not deliver us the quantity, the quality, or let alone the affordability of the homes we need. And yet by pumping vast amounts of money through the Help to Buy channel, we've effectively made all of public policy not only kind of dependent on that model, we've made our public sector entirely complicit in it, because we're now subsidising it to the tune of £16 billion and dependent essentially on it continuing to deliver rising prices. Except, of course, the entire point of trying to boost housing supply was supposed to be to lower prices. So the government has now kind of crystallised the contradiction in its own housing policy. I I don't say this in particular criticism of this current government. This has been true for every government I can remember. It's fundamentally true, I think, for the British people as a whole. We both want house prices to come down so that people can afford them, but go up so that my house doesn't have to go down in value. And all governments find themselves having to negotiate that fundamental contradiction. But now the government isn't just trying to negotiate it rhetorically or in policy terms. It is literally trying to fudge that in financial terms, because we want house prices to go down. We're pumping money in to boost supply, to make it cheaper for people. But at the same time, the government needs prices to keep rising so that it doesn't lose £16 billion of investment in the existing property market. So all of these are kind of foreseeable and foreseen consequences of a policy of subsidizing a particular model of house building and a particular model of home purchase. However, the final note of caution I would add is that don't forget just how popular this is. Right? This is an overwhelmingly, popular policy. When I was at Shelter and we were campaigning against this sort of thing, we focus grouped it, we polled it. People love Help to Buy, they really do. It feels like a very, very good policy for governments to be supporting, and it's a difficult one politically to challenge because it doesn't feel like welfare. It doesn't feel like corporate subsidy, even though you could argue that it is both of those things. It feels like, for most people, just a little bit of a helping hand to help yourself and get on the housing ladder and do the right thing. And that's a very hard political narrative to challenge. Unfortunately, that also means it's a very, very hard thing to stop once you've started. Not only are you financially on the hook, you're then politically on the hook for continuing this as well. And that is no coincidence. We now find ourselves nearly 10 years down the line, continually having this debate and continually kicking the can further down the road. So I would really urge extreme caution and hope that Ireland can actually look to some slightly more positive ways of supporting people into home ownership and supporting housing supply.
Gurmagh, Toby, that was very interesting, and some stark warnings, I think, there as well. I think it's a very interesting point that you made in relation to the fact that as soon as people move in, a lot of the kind of subsidy really kind of immediately vanishes, but not for the person obviously with the loan. So I think that's a very interesting point. David, I might go to you next, and I know you want to touch on a range of different issues, but if you could maybe first of all lead out with your view on this scheme and I suppose the potential impact of it.
Absolutely. Mairéad, how are you? Lovely to meet you. Not in the flesh, but over the Zoom. Toby, thank you really very much for that extremely informative and I think conclusive view of this scheme. Eoin, thanks very much for inviting me here. And how are you doing, everyone, on this miserable owl evening in Dublin and wherever you are around the country? The first thing I'd like to say, I'd pick up from Toby's first point, was that this is politically really, really popular. And what you find is these types of schemes are politically popular because there's a thing in economics called the paradox of aggregation. And that means what is good for the individual is not always good for the community. And so when I get this little subsidy, me, David McWilliams, I feel great about this as a buyer, as a consumer, but it's only good if nobody else gets it, okay? But when everybody else gets it, it has a very strange, and all interventions in the housing market on the demand side have this problem. And the paradox of aggregation is, imagine you're at a football match, right? And you're sitting down and you get a reasonably good view, but not a very, very good view. And the guy or girl in front of you stands up, okay? And then you stand up to get a better view. And then the person behind you stands up, and the person behind you, and the person behind you. And suddenly the whole of the stadium is standing when we had paid to sit. So imagine that. So this works the same way. If I get this subsidy, okay, and I'm a first-time buyer, my getting the subsidy throws the gauntlet down to everybody else. And all that happens is we all get the subsidy, house prices all rise, so everybody's standing up at the stadium, and nobody gets a better view. So the first thing to appreciate, Mairéad, is that what is good for the individual in economics, this is one of the interesting things about economics and counterintuitive things, is not always good for the collective, number one. Number two, I think, with all policies, you need to ask who is benefiting, okay? Who is actually benefiting, right? And then it's very simple. If you follow the money, these things are not that difficult. And who is benefiting here are clearly landowners and land developers and our rather dysfunctional banking system. Now, why is that? Because the only reason this has been brought in, let's be really clear, is because the average person cannot afford a house at these prices. That's why it's been brought in. It's not been brought in for any other reason, okay? So this is a way of validating already elevated house prices, okay? Because what we're doing here is not only do you have a loan to a bank, but you also have a loan to the state, in effect, right? So who is benefiting are the people who are benefiting from the elevated house prices that we suffer in this country. Third thing then is let's look at the housing market. The election last year was on the 8th of February. Today's the 4th of February, so we're about a year, right? We have had a pandemic where the economy has been closed down. All parties promised to reduce house prices, expand supply, etc. House prices, as of last week, if you look at DAFT or any of the up-to-date reports, will tell you that house prices are rising between 5 and 6, 7% per year, wherever you are in the country. So let's look at the situation. The situation has disimproved despite the fact that the economy has collapsed in effect. Not so much collapsed, but has been put into cold storage, number one. Number two, the only people who benefit from this are developers and the banks, okay? And number three, the individual who benefits from it doesn't benefit from it, because if we all benefit from it, it cancels out the benefit, and all we have is a ratcheting up and validation of higher prices. So as somebody who's a citizen, as somebody who also has 2 children, late teens, beginning to figure out when do we move out of that? Actually, by the way, I don't think they'll move out at all, but that's another issue. That's my own, there are our own dilemmas. But I'm thinking as a father as well as an economist, okay? How are they going to find their way in the course of the next 10 years? Where are they going to live? The other issue, and I think it's crucial, is that these conversations that we're having amongst ourselves should all be about how do we get, and Toby touched on this, house prices down, not up. Okay, this is the whole thing, right? How do we expand supply so that the person on the average wage can afford a decent home and can go about their own lives without having to worry about house prices, mortgages, and in the extreme, homelessness. So in a way, we're being deflected from the conversation we should be having. So I think that I can't add anything to Toby's very, very rigorous and from bitter experience, very honest review. We have no reason to believe that what happened in the UK will not be repeated here. Okay, so it's not that the UK is a different market in terms of the way in which psychology works. And of course, the last thing, Mairéad, is that housing is such an unusual nexus of need, of greed, of finance, of taxation, of planning, of demography, of a whole sort of, and this is why economists like Toby are so welcome in the debate, because they understand that this is not a one factor issue. It is multifaceted. And ultimately, we in Ireland have to try and get to a situation where we're adopting policies that are explicitly forcing down land prices and house prices. Our dilemma here, and we have many, but on this issue, is every time prices rise or are validated by rising prices, traditional economists will come on the telly and they'll say, well, Mairéad, prices are rising, and what's going to happen then is demand is going to fall. But that's actually not what happens. What happens when prices rise, people panic. They panic and they think, my God, prices are rising. I will bring forward my decision and I'll borrow from every Tom, Dick and Harry to do so. That's the first thing. Second thing is economists would say, well, you know, when prices rise, supply will rise in response and we'll get a supply response and the market will clear. Well, that's not what happens either. What actually happens is that when prices rise, the people with land say, Jesus, prices are rising. I'm not going to sell today. I'm going to sell next year and make 50 grand more, 100 grand more. So it facilitates hoarding. So as long as we play around at the margins with these, frankly, Mickey Mouse type of developer-led, and by the way, can I just, before I stop, we need developers, we need builders, we need the construction industry. These are part of the solution, okay? But they cannot be the drivers, the unique drivers of every solution. So I've laid out a few points there. Back to Toby, because he again has been working at the coalface on this.
Well, I think it's very interesting, and you hit on a lot of points there in relation to people's views on it and all that kind of thing. And I do think, I just want to say actually to one thing now, people are putting questions into the chat, and I just encourage people to continue putting in any questions that they might have into the chat, and we'll see how many we can get through in the time that we have. But I suppose one thing that a lot of people, or a lot of concern that there's been, is that the scheme obviously will have, you know, an inflationary effect, which is obviously what we've been discussing. But Toby, I'd be interested in specifically, because one thing that we have, you know, as part of the discussion was that it hasn't really had that much of an inflationary effect. But in relation specifically, I suppose, to those kind of higher densely populated areas with higher prices, what kind of an impact has it had in terms of inflation in Britain?
Well, as I said, I think the evidence, such as is that it clearly has inflated house prices. It's very hard to say exactly how much, because the counterfactual is kind of impossible. What would the world have been like if we hadn't pumped £16 billion of government loans in over the last 9 years? I mean, who knows? We have. But I think all the evidence suggests that it has definitely inflated house prices, definitely. And particularly, obviously, in the new build sector, which has increasingly become more expensive than the existing housing market. And that is despite the fact that Help to Buy is specifically restricted, always increasingly restricted, to new build properties, and thankfully will now be restricted to first-time buyers. So, you know, these are reasonable restrictions, but even so, it is still, because they are the engine of new money coming into the housing market, that has driven house prices up, and therefore distorted all sorts of other decisions. It has distorted developer decisions, it has distorted landowner decisions, it's distorted the market itself, which is why it's impossible to say exactly how much it's inflated prices, but it must have, it simply must have.
Mairéad, can I just come in there? Inflated prices are not the unintended consequence of this policy. They are the intended consequence of this policy. This is what we have to get into, thinking that the intention here is to validate already excessively high prices by bringing another level of debt or equity, depends what you want to call it, into the equation. So let's not fool ourselves what's going on here, okay? What is going on here is that at a certain stage, when you break down the cost, and I think Eoin has done this extremely well on television and in manifestos and policy documents, you'll see where the inflation is. Now, if you have an already problematic housing market, intervening on the demand side to boost demand will only inflate house prices. And if I am right and the supply will respond very sluggishly or not at all until the market clears at the higher price, all we're going to do is ratchet up and up and up. Now, those of you old enough to be knocking around about 15 years ago will have known that I spent the first maybe 5 or 6 years of my public career here on television arguing against house price inflation, saying we would have a collapse. House prices will collapse. It is a developer, banker cabal facilitated by the government. You know, if you told me, Mairéad, that in 2021 I'd be back talking about this, I would have said, Jesus wept. You know, have we learned nothing? And we've got to really keep bashing home this idea. Who benefits, why, and that's where we start the conversation, where we finish is a different discussion, but we've got to start there.
That's interesting. A question that came in the chat there is, in terms of the concern that buyers might be taking on an unknown level of debt. And I think, Toby, you did touch on that in your remarks as well. And also another question that came is how big is the risk of negative equity, and is it hard for those who avail of the scheme to sell and move given the cost of the equity? So maybe Toby.
Yeah, and the short answer is yes. Those are very real risks. And it's still too early to really say what it has definitely led to those consequences, because there haven't been that many sales of people who bought under Help to Buy yet. It's only been running for 8 years. Most of those people have not sold or have not yet had encountered serious problems, not least because interest rates are on the floor. And even when you start paying interest on the government equity loan after 5 years, it starts at a very low rate. So we have yet to see all of these problems playing out, but they must surely be coming fairly soon, especially if there's a spike in interest rates, and especially if there is a fall in house prices, because a lot of people are going to find themselves caught out. A lot of people are going to find that if they try and sell their homes, they're not able to get the price that they thought they were. Because essentially that new build premium has gone, house price inflation maybe hasn't matched what they expected it would, and their incomes have not, grown rapidly as they maybe were expecting that they would have when they bought 5-6 years ago. So all of those problems are still to come, but we can't yet point to hard evidence that they're happening in droves. But I live in fear of the fact that we are going to hit a negative equity problem, a widespread repayment problem, and those will all be then suddenly the government's fault. I mean, people blame the government when anything goes wrong, but this time around it really will be very directly the government's fault, because it'll be the government you owe the money to.
Mairéad, can I just come in there? This is. Let's be very clear what's happening. In the United States at the moment, there's an extraordinary financial market frenzy in unusual stocks and short selling, all this sort of thing, which is a function of the financialization of people's lives. This is the casinoization of the housing market that we're looking at. And we've got to be very, very clear about this, because once you start to take on excessive levels of debt, irrespective of how those debts are structured or who you owe it to, your own financial position becomes extremely fragile. Debt makes people vulnerable. Let's be absolutely clear about what happens, okay? You're vulnerable. You're not only vulnerable to interest rates, you're vulnerable to sentiment, you're vulnerable to all sorts of things that can happen. If you lumber an individual or a couple with an excessive level of debt, what you're actually doing is you're paying out the developer today. This is what you're doing. And you are lumbering the worker or the buyer for the next 30 years, right? Now, those 30 years, anything can happen, Mairéad. And again, I come back to where we were, when I was doing this on TV in 2004, 5, people said, don't worry, prices will always keep going up. It'll be grand. It'll be all fine, Well, it wasn't all fine. So look at this for what it is. It is the casinoization of the most basic human right, which is shelter and accommodation. And we need to nail this for what it is, right? And stop pussyfooting around about also, because again, a lot of finance, if you think of, we're talking about financial engineering, right? Mairéad, most engineering makes things safer, okay? So if you get a bridge engineer, he or she will make the bridge safer. Financial engineering makes the system more fragile, okay? Please understand this, that the more jiggery-pokery, the more levels of equity and debt and this and that we put on, ultimately, the bigger the burden the consumer carries. And there are many vested interests in this country that want this to continue, but I think a conversation like this adds a bit of clarity to what's going on. And again, I'm talking not just as an economist, but as a citizen, as a father, as somebody who looks around the country and sees what's going on.
Absolutely, and I'll come back in with a question, but just on your point there about, you know, having these kind of conversations, and one person, I suppose, mentioned there in the chat that it's a pity we don't see more of this level of debate, I suppose, on the national airwaves. But David, I might go to you first in relation to this. One question that came in was what you feel the level of risk is to the taxpayer, and I'll bring Toby in then, and then I have another question from the chat there for Eoin. But David, what would you feel in terms of a risk to the taxpayer?
Well, there's always, I mean, basically, the one thing we know about housing markets, particularly as evolved in the English-speaking world, is that they are highly cyclical. They're highly, highly cyclical. And house prices will tend to only increase above their long-term average if there is leverage. They will only fall below their long-term average if there are defaults. Okay, this is, you know, as the Americans say, economics 101, right? That house prices should be determined by demographic growth and general inflation in the economy, but they're not. They're determined by giddiness, by expectation, by leverage, by the mood of the herd. You know, let's not forget, by gossip, by all these things. And the more leverage you put in, the more fragile they become, and the more likely they are to overshoot and undershoot. The only basis for whether house prices, Mairéad, are over or undervalued should be as a percentage of income. Income is the foundational price in any economy. And if your house prices are soaring way, way, way above income ratios, you have a problem. What this is doing is it's solidifying, or I think Toby used the word earlier on, crystallizing that elevated price. So the taxpayer is on the hook, the individual is on the hook, and ultimately what we have is a situation, and I come back to it, and let's not kid ourselves, we need to get policies that will bring house prices down. The only policies that will bring house prices down when we have a rise in population is a significant ramp up of house building. I don't care if it's built by public sector, private sector, developed, I don't care as long as it's built. I have no ideology when it comes to that. But what I do have an ideology about is a scheme which is very clear to me benefits one side of the bargain and not the other. Then I worry a lot.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting points. Toby, do you want to come in on that in terms of the risk to the taxpayer? And then I'm going to go with another question from the chat to Eoin.
I mean, yes, there must be at least two risks to the taxpayer. One is that a lot of those equity loans go bad. I mean, to be honest, though, I'm less concerned about that because to a certain extent that is already a sunk cost. That is £16 billion the UK government has already spent. It's kind of got what it wanted for it. It's got people onto the housing ladder and it's got homes built. So if it never gets that money back, sure, that's a balance sheet hit. But in the grand scheme of things, it's not the biggest problem. I think the bigger problem is that it distorts government decision making such that government will therefore have an even greater interest in keeping house prices up in order to get its money back. So yes, there is a risk to the taxpayer. It's not the biggest. That's not the worst problem here. It's that it distorts everything that government does. Well, it will distort future decisions as well.
Well, it's interesting. One person said, presumably the expectation that the government have is that the people will deem it a success and will be allowed to continue indefinitely. And I think that's maybe what the kind of warning you gave us at the very beginning. But over to you, Eoin. One person asked, how close is Darragh Broin's plan to the one that Toby and David have just warned us about the dangers of, and is it in essence a carbon copy of this, do you think?
Sure, Murray, thanks, and it's very interesting to listen to both Toby and David. So the broad parameters of the scheme are the same, in the sense that there's no income cap for applicants, and I'll come back to that in a second. Obviously, the price caps for the properties are different, but that's because the nominal prices of properties in London and outside of London are different to ours. But the principle that you have those caps is broadly the same. I suppose one big difference is that the government are actively, as I said at the start, trying to involve the Irish pillar banks in this scheme. And my understanding is at a very early stage in the English and Welsh version of this, there was some level of bank involvement, but that was ended. And I think for some of the same reasons as some people are concerned about the bank involvement in the proposed Irish scheme. A few other bits of information that are really interesting, because there are some people on the Irish side saying that the scheme across the water didn't inflate house prices. And the most recent piece of research that I've come across is one by 3 economists in the London School of Economics. And they produced a really detailed paper and analysis of the scheme in 2018. And what they found was the average house price increase under the shared equity loan, and they call it Help to Buy shared equity loan in England, but that's not to be confused with our Help to Buy tax rebate. It's a separate scheme. But their shared equity loan on average increased house prices between 3 and 4%. But in fact, in London, it was significantly higher than that. There was a question into the chat about, did it increase the supply of homes? And the answer is yes. But many of them were in the wrong place. And the increase in demand was 3 to 4 times greater than the increase in supply. So, of course, the net position of supply and demand was even worse. The other thing that nobody has mentioned is who actually got access to the shared equity loan across the water. And there was a really interesting Westminster Public Accounts Committee report published at the end of 2019. And they concluded that 60% of the people who availed of that scheme, and as Toby has said, at that point it was in the region of £17 billion sterling that had been spent. 60% of people who availed of this didn't need it. They had actually already secured enough mortgage finance to be able to buy. So the shared equity scheme was actually basically allowing people who could already buy in the market to buy larger or better properties for themselves. And then, of course, for those people who did benefit from it, in inverted commas, carried all of those risks. I think the main difference is whether or not the banks will be involved in the scheme here. And if they are, what is the additional interest rate charge? And I suppose one small point to mention in that, part of our macroprudential rules aren't just about to ensure that people don't borrow more than they can afford, but it's also for people to have full visibility on their loan. If I go into a bank today to get a mortgage, they will be able to tell me how much I'm going to pay over the lifetime of the mortgage between the purchase, or between the loan and the interest rate. With this shared equity product, no bank or no government agency can answer that question, because they don't know how much house prices are going to go up or down, and therefore they won't know the total value of the shared equity at any point in time. And for example, if the interest rate is linked, for example, to inflation or indexed in some other way, they won't be able to say what the total amount of interest is. And if they can't tell the borrower what their liability is on the shared equity loan, how can they make a credible assessment as to whether, for example, you or I, if we're getting that loan, actually has the ability to pay? So the central bank's assessment of this is going to be really, really interesting. But absolutely all of the risks that Toby outlined are certainly in the scheme that's been proposed as we understand it at this point in time.
That's very interesting, and it actually comes to another question, and this is, I suppose, a broader question. Maybe I'm trying to turn it into a more positive, but we have one person saying, first of all, is there anything that can be done to actually stop this? And I'm going to go to Toby next, and also, what is the alternative that will directly impact middle income households? And they give a figure of between 36,000 and 80,000 here, and what are views on that? But Toby, I might link in with you there first. Is there any in terms of alternatives, and then I'll go back to Eoin in relation to that, and then there's some questions specifically for David as well.
Yes, I would say the alternative has always been something that has always been out there. We've just never really given it a chance, and that is, we need to, echoing what David said, we need to start separating the desire for home ownership from the desire to make unearned speculative wealth gains from being a homeowner. because the first is totally reasonable. There's many good reasons to want to own your own home. It's not a bad thing in the slightest, and it's perfectly reasonable aspiration to have that security, to know that you're not going to have to pay housing costs in your old age, to have a permanent home that's yours. These are all perfectly good, valid things that government policy should be supporting. The problem is we've allowed ourselves, particularly in the Anglo sphere kind of economies, to associate that with a completely different thing, which is to make vast amounts of unearned tax-free wealth gain just by the privilege of being well housed. And there have been many years over my lifetime in which homeowners in the UK, and it's certainly true in Ireland as well, looking at what house prices have done there, have made more by being homeowners than they have from going out to work. And this is just a very obvious kind of moral outrage, is what Adam Smith railed against. And it distorts everybody's choices. Why on earth would you go and work hard if you can make more just by having a home? So. And the fact that we then overly reward that in the tax system. So if you do have the temerity to go and work hard and earn money, you'll be taxed on that, but you won't be taxed on the unearned gain you make from the house price. This is crazy. So we've allowed these two things to become kind of absolutely intertwined in people's minds, and we're all kind of guilty of that to a certain extent. So I think that the better solution is to start separating the two and say, of course you can own a home, and actually you should be able to, as David said, buy one much more cheaply. You shouldn't. However, the reason for buying that is so that you have a secure place to live, not so that you can speculate on extracting rent from the economy for the rest of time. So if you buy a home at a reasonable rate, you should sell it at a reasonable rate. And it's not difficult to do that. I mean, community land trusts have been doing this for decades in various different models. If you lock in a discount on the price in the first place, but you just say, well, when you sell it, you will sell it at that same discount. Or there's lots of different variants. You can peg the resale formula to local wage growth, so that the affordability will remain on average the same. There's a million different ways you can slightly tweak the policy, but essentially it means you buy at a reasonable price and you sell at a reasonable price. And there's absolutely no reason why we couldn't be doing that on a vastly bigger scale. We've been doing it on a tiny kind of fringe scale for decades, but that to my mind should be the kind of mainstream policy solution that offers genuine home ownership to all of those millions of people that quite reasonably want to own their own home.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And Eoin, I might bring you in on that as well. And also what can be done. A few people have asked now what can be done politically, I suppose, to pressure, what kind of political pressure, what can be done to stop it. And as one person said, even the name, the Help to Buy scheme, I suppose, is separate, but it says here, even the name Help to Buy is so appealing. The reality is that so many people are finding it impossible to get a mortgage, and it really is true. So is there anything that can be done politically? And another interesting point that I saw was, instead of demand side schemes, why aren't the government pushing, supply side schemes, thousands of vacant properties all over towns and cities? So I'll bring in Eoin first, and then I'll bring in David, and I'll add another question for David as well.
Sure, and to confuse things even more, the government is actually suggesting that home buyers will be able to combine the Help to Buy tax relief that's already in place. And as people know, that's a tax relief on tax that you've already paid, up to 10% of the purchase price of the home, with a cap of €30,000.
Yeah, so apologies for confusing by using.
No. The confusion isn't yours. Your scheme is called the Help to Buy Shared Equity Loan. We have two separate schemes. One is called Help to Buy, which is a tax relief, and the other is Shared Equity, which is the shared equity proposal. But the important point I wanted to make was the government is talking about allowing you to combine both, so that you would be able to avail of a portion of the share of the Help to Buy tax relief. They haven't said it would be the full 10% of the market value of the home, but you'd be able to combine that with the shared equity loan, which seems to be even more, I suppose, fuel to the fire. I suppose two things I want to say is the first is it is important to say that one of the reasons why the scheme is in place is because the gap between the sales price of homes, particularly in Dublin, and the ability of income earners between 45,000 and 85,000 gross is so wide that something has to be done. And of course, government has decided, following intensive lobbying from industry, that filling that gap by the state owning a portion of the home is the solution. The real debate we should be having is how to bring those house prices down. And Toby mentioned one very clear policy. But for example, today, myself and folks from my office met with O'Coulon Co-Housing. They're a housing co-op. They work in conjunction with local authorities. And they are today building really good quality starter homes and apartments, 1 beds, 2 beds and 3 beds. And they're selling them from €230,000 to a maximum price of 250,000, and that's for an apartment. And they went through all their costings with us, etc. Now, they do get access to lower cost public land. They do obviously not operate on a profit. They take a small admin fee as a not-for-profit housing co-op. And they're involved in about 8 or 9 sites in Dublin and in Cork. They've been operating since 2016. So here's very clearly a model whereby local authorities working in conjunction with not-for-profits can deliver really good quality homes at a genuinely affordable price. I suppose the one weakness of the model that's in place, and in fact O'Coulon, the co-op, recognise this, they would much prefer that when they sell those houses that the land is not sold, so that the person who buys the house buys the bricks and mortar, and they pay maybe a little bit less. They might pay 210,000, 220,000. They own that house. It's theirs to do what any other homeowner wants to do with it. But there are 2 conditions on the use of the land, because the land would remain in public ownership. One is the property can never be rented out in the private rental sector. It has to be a family home. But secondly, if you ever want to sell that property, you cannot sell it into the open market and make a windfall gain from the sale of the land. What you have to do is sell it back into the affordable housing scheme to another affordable purchaser at the original affordable price, index linked for example, home improvements and inflation. And what that would do is it would completely break the speculative investment in land and people cashing in on the windfall gain to having a permanent stock of tradable, affordable homes, somewhere in between social housing, which is always subsidised, and open market housing, which is speculative. And it would constrain the price. And if government in the affordable housing bill that is coming before the Oireachtas Housing Committee in the next number of weeks seriously entertain that, what we could start to do is invest very significant sums of money. Some would be from institutional investors, some for the public purse, in building a stock of publicly tradable, affordable homes. But crucially, the land is not part of the sale or the equation. And I think to answer the question about what can be done, we need to start arguing very strongly for that segment of working people, individuals and couples earning between 45 and 85,000. We have to start mobilising those people to flex their voice to say, bring the price of good quality, well-built homes down, because that was one of the driving forces in the general election this time last year. Everybody will remember the exit poll showed housing was the single biggest issue that motivated people to vote. Fianna Fáil and the party who are both the Taoiseach and the Minister for Housing said very clearly they were going to deliver 50,000 affordable homes at prices below 250,000. What they're now saying is, if you can just about afford a home at 300,000, but of course there's very few on the new market to buy, they're going to give you extra credit between 50 and 100,000 to buy a home of 400,000. So people power, people organising, mobilising, engaging whatever way they can to say, we want the policies we were promised in the general election, large volumes of good quality, genuinely affordable homes in a way that's not just affordable for the first purchaser, but indefinitely into the future for all future purchasers. And that's a proposition that not only is a good idea, it has the support of the Economic and Social Research Institute, the National Economic and Social Council, the Housing Agency, all bodies funded by government to provide good quality policy advice. And it's one that doesn't have the risks of the scheme across the water in England and Wales that Toby has warned us of. Thanks, Mairéad.
Thanks, Eoin. And David, over to you. You can make points on all those questions, but there's a few questions that were specifically as well for you. David, do you think that this shared equity scheme with increasing interest rates is just the government looking to get their piece of the pie? I don't see it as them looking to help anyone but the banks and themselves. The government have never looked to help low to middle income earners, so why would they start now? Another question, has history not shown that subsidising house building only leads to higher prices for the consumer? And one extra one just for a bit of fun is, what role could a constitutional right to a home play in this? So, David, your views.
Wow.
Not to land you with,
Thanks for
I'm
those
basically asking you to sort
three
everything
hospital
out in
passes.
one go.
And first of all, I'd like to say, I think what Eoin has outlined is the future. Okay, so let's not beat around the bush. What Eoin has outlined is the future, and it involves disentangling land and land speculation from accommodation and the cost of accommodation. That's absolutely crucial. You know, it's quite interesting if you look at successful economies like Germany and how they treat land. They treat land as a cost to the society, okay, rather than some speculative asset to be punted up and down every time interest rates go up and down. And we should always follow the best. I don't know why we don't follow the best practice, okay? So what sort of economy do you want? You kind of wouldn't mind something that looks and smells and feels a bit like modern day Germany. Okay, well, what do? Oh, on the issue of land, as Eoin has put out, Germans have a variety of various different cooperative-based schemes, which suppresses land and house inflation, because they know that house price inflation is simply a transfer, and this is the crazy thing, from workers to landlords and from young to old. This is what it is, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is Eoin's scheme is eminently financeable. At the moment, the European Central Bank is begging governments to issue IOUs, long-term debt, in order to finance serious infrastructural deficits. They're begging, right? This is a one-off in history, right? Ireland could now issue a 100-year bond, okay? The British, believe it or not, only paid back their First World War debt 2 years ago, okay? You can issue a 100-year bond. This can entirely finance what Eoin is talking about. You can identify whether it's derelict buildings, whether it's sites, whatever. Do whatever. It's eminently financeable, but you need to make sure that the people who hold the finance do not want to flip it in capital gain. The alchemy of finance, if there is such a thing, is that in the right hands, you can do extraordinary things, but in the wrong hands, you can be hyper-destructive, right? And I fear it's going to be in the wrong hands here. But finally, the only point I want to make is that the party, and Toby started saying, you know, the Help to Buy is very attractive to the individual. The political party that fixes housing will be rewarded for generations in this country, generations. Because, and I remember as a kid, people would talk about around here in Dunleary, Fianna Fáil. Those lads, they sorted us out, or they sorted my dad out for a house, council houses years ago, right? For 2 or 3 generations, Fianna Fáil inherited that vote, okay? So whoever it is that fixes this, and fixing it means secure accommodation at a reasonable price for working families. That's what we're talking about. Whoever does this, I think, will reap an extraordinary positive political legacy. And the game is open. It's open for everyone. So I would say what Eoin is talking about is the future. Just the couple of questions on history, subsidies, I'll just answer them all in one. Any intervention on the demand side of any problem, when the problem is supply, will fail. That's it. And to answer Eoin's question a little bit about the central bank and whatever, it would be hard for me to conceive of a professionally trained economist who would agree with this proposal. So I think you'll have to scour down the back of the couch to find economists who will say this is a good idea.
Thank you, David. We're trying to keep this to an hour when we started, not just a little bit after 7. So Toby, there's one question here for you, and then I'll go to Eoin to wrap up. But Toby, hindsight being 2020, if you could go back to the inception of this scheme in Britain, what else was being touted around the time that you feel could have been more successful? And what example of a successful scheme implemented in another jurisdiction do you think was a success?
Well, yeah. I suppose with hindsight, what could I have done with £16 billion of public subsidy differently? Well, quite a lot. I mean, and it's tempting. The simplest answer would just be, well, you just reflate the properly non-market social housing budget, right? I mean, that's the easiest, most straightforward thing. But I do think that we're trying to talk about something different here, which is about that kind of middle market of people who want home ownership and can't afford it. And I do think there is more that could have been done there. So as I mentioned earlier, I think it's the community land trust type model where you take land out of the market in perpetuity. And I, was very interested in what Eoin was proposing there, because it's exactly the sort of thing I've been talking about for years. And where you take land out of the market in perpetuity, you make home ownership affordable at the entry point, but it is also affordable at the exit point. And that's a straight deal for the consumer. It's sure, you get home ownership and you get it at a much cheaper rate than you get in the market, but the deal is you will not get rich out of this. Right? Look after your property, you can keep it up, you can maintain your equity value fine, but you are not going to be riding the market and cashing out massively, nor are your heirs. And that's the deal. And I think there's a market for that. There's certainly a market with that and amongst people who are priced out in perpetuity. There's also a market for it amongst people who are going to get burnt by the housing crash when it comes. And like David, I've been confidently predicting a massive housing crash for at least 20 years, and I've been spectacularly wrong so far. But it is still going to come. And when it does, there will be a big political opportunity to rescue those homeowners.
By the way, we were right here on the property crash. That's just for the record.
It still hasn't come here. But when it does happen, when there is a correction and lots of people find themselves in negative equity and faced with repossession, there will be a real opportunity to rescue those people and say, okay, you can retain your home and we will sort out, we'll clear your debts, we'll cancel your debts, but the quid pro quo is you revert to this sort of sustainable home ownership in which you don't get to cash in on any future gains. Right? So that's what I would have done with 16 billion. I would have given it to the nascent community land trust movement to scale up dramatically.
That sounds good to us, Toby. Where it's a pity you didn't have that 16 billion instead, but there was a lot of questions there, so it's difficult to get through them all. But I see one person suggesting high-speed rail to Cork, Limerick and Galway, and as somebody has to go from Galway to Dublin, I definitely agree with that. But Eoin, I'll hand it over to you to wrap up.
Look, thanks very much. And there was one question that was asked a couple of times about surely a better solution would just be to zero VAT on new properties. The problem, of course, is there's no way of forcing the developer to pass on that cut. And the worry many of us have would just be pocketed by some, if not many, of the developers. Look, the first thing I want to say is a huge thanks both to David and Toby, and we've been doing these seminars for a while, and we're always trying to bring somebody to the debate. So while David is well known to us all and his contribution here is really welcome, Toby's work is really, really great. And I just want to plug shamelessly Toby's book. It's Rethinking the Economics of Land and Housing with Larry McFarlane and Josh Ryan Collins. And I just want to say that the reason I'm plugging it is because there's no point in us coming here and criticizing bad schemes. We have to be in the business of proposing real, credible, implementable alternatives. And there's a very significant chapter at the end of this book which does exactly that. And we've only touched on a few of those. From our point of view, the solutions are as follows. In the first instance, we need large-scale public investment on public housing on public land. And what that means is good quality mixed income estates where social renters, affordable cost renters and affordable purchasers on the model I've outlined live in mixed communities, economically viable, culturally viable, where you can walk to school and work and shop and be on high frequency public transport networks. And that's not just for Dublin or Cork or Galway, it's also for Athlone and Mullingar and smaller towns as well. But it's not all just about public housing on public land. There are other models, for example, in the Netherlands, where they use zoning to constrain what developers can do on land, or indeed encourage good practice. We had a meeting recently with Toby, and we were discussing the idea of giving owners of brownfield sites a rezoning option to residential, but as part of the conditions of the rezoning, you constrain them in terms of master planning and purchase or rental prices. Likewise, in the Netherlands, for example, they have interesting models where the state takes on the responsibility of providing land, servicing it, and master planning it. And then they contract out who will provide the housing to rent or buy, but they set the price. So while our preference is in the first instance priming direct public investment in public housing, and as David said, there's a significant amount of zero or negative interest loans available to the state. There's other models out there as well. This can be done. It's been done in other countries, and the community land trust model that Toby mentioned is one in which small networks of community housing trust activists here are arguing for, and that's something we would support as well. So all I'd say to people is this: a year ago we were entering the final days of the general election campaign, and there was a real expectation that change was about to happen. And you could see in the days afterwards, when we saw the results, those parties arguing for the greatest level of change, including and especially in housing policy, were the parties who did the best out of the elections. Various things have intervened, and obviously we're dealing with the very real pandemic of COVID-19, but the demand for change hasn't gone away, and people need real alternatives. They need credible plans that can deliver good quality, affordable homes to rent or buy for working people locked out of the market. And we're not the only people arguing this, but we believe we have the solutions, along with the expert views of others, of which we've heard tonight. So look, if you don't like the sound of this shared equity scheme, get involved, get organised, let your local TDs and councillors know, get on the radio, get on the newspapers, join the Raise the Roof housing campaign led by the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, the NGO movement, or even better still, join a political party and get involved in delivering real change the next time we have a general election. I want to thank Mairéad Farrell for chairing tonight's expert debate. And as one of our newly elected TDs, Mairéad has really laid her mark in the first year as our new public expenditure and reform spokesperson. So she's one to watch and keep an eye on her. We're going to do more of these discussions, so keep an eye out on Facebook, Twitter, and all the usual platforms. And all I'd urge you to do is take the information you've got today, share it, be part of the public debate, and crucially, be part of the change that you want to see in Ireland today and tomorrow. Thanks very much, everybody, and have a safe night.
Cheers, thanks.